Hello Zimbabwe, Southern Africa, Africa and the world at large. Welcome to the Say What Studio of Choice. Today, in the Say What Studio of Choice, we will be talking about the role of young people in demanding accountability on the rights to education. I'm your hostess, my name is Nadia Mutisi and welcome to the show. Joining me today in the Say What Studio of Choice is Lars, who's representing Education Out Loud, Hazel Jojo, who's standing in for the Web for Life activists, and we have Thembani, who's going to be speaking on behalf of Sexual and Reproductive Health Defenders. Welcome to the studio, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, so before we get into what we're talking about today, I'm just going to give a brief outline of what education in Zimbabwe and education in the region is looking like. As many of you probably know, we have the frameworks in place that are requiring our governments to provide education for our young people, such as National Development Strategy number 1, when we look at SDG number 4, and we have a number of different frameworks that have been put into place. However, the problem comes in terms of enforcement of these particular frameworks. For instance, in Zimbabwe, we understand that when the COVID-19 pandemic started, or at peak COVID-19 pandemic, a number of young people were unable to go back to school due to child marriages and due to early to pregnancies. Amongst all of these things as well, we understand from our National Development Strategy number 1 that some young people have not been able to enroll into schools because of the cost of actually getting enrolled into these particular schools. We also understand that girls become the most disadvantaged when it comes to issues such as climate change, issues such as pandemics, such as COVID-19, and therefore the main stakeholder is the girl child who is not able to go back to school because of religion and all of these other things that affect these particular girl children. Now, what we have in place today, what we're going to be discussing is the GEAR Alliance, which is Girls Education Advocacy in the region. And within the GEAR Alliance, we have organizations such as FACET, such as NAKES, such as GAIO, such as Say What that are involved. These are 3 countries, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Zambia. So today we're going to be discussing on these particular issues. How can young people, such as the young people that are joining me today, actively engage with stakeholders to ensure that education is provided for within their communities? I will start with Lars. All right, so my question for you today is, what are some of the advocacy strategies that can be employed by young people to demand for equitable and inclusive education for rural girls and young women?
I think first and foremost, I would mention the concept of voice. Young people have experience and even more so aspirations, dreams, hopes to the future. But an advocacy strategy must take into consideration that often the voice of young people are not heard. Maybe young people are so desperate, so frustrated that they give up even before articulating what their dreams are. So providing voice, a space for young people to express their desires, their expectations, is a first critical step to convince young people that there's somebody out there who wants to listen to the messages that they have. That's a critical first step. Secondly, I believe that there's also a need to work with young people to package the messages, because if you shout all of you at the same time in different directions for different audiences with different messages, then nobody will hear you, because one voice is overshadowing the other one. Okay. So you need to somehow stand together. You need to agree and focus your messages to your audience.
All right. You work for a pretty big organization, and I'm sure you've worked with different countries and different young people in different places. Where have you actively seen young people actually engaging and ensuring that whatever it is that they're fighting for, whether it's education or sexual and reproductive health rights, do you have any case study where you can say these young people did such a brilliant job in terms of bringing about such results?
You may be surprised to hear that. Okay. But my first visit to Zimbabwe was 32 years ago as a staff member of the Danish Youth Council. Okay. So I'm coming back. I've been coming back to Zimbabwe over the years, and actually what I experience today is a dramatically different situation. Okay. The country is in a quite different place, but so are youth in Zimbabwe. And I actually see in this very country people who are concerned, who are even sort of bordering to be desperate, but also people who are not giving up. So I'm seeing efforts by young people in Zimbabwe happening every day using the voice of their generation to make other people listen, to make other people understand that the youth, the majority of the population in Zimbabwe and elsewhere, are actually having a message and are having expectations that somebody will pick up these messages. But I can also say that in my own country, which is Denmark, we also have young people fighting on the same agendas, and it's not straightforward. It's a lot of, if not outright repression, then sort of carelessness. We're used to hear young people complain, we're used to hear young people agitated, shouting even, and yet there's a general attitude among decision makers, time will pass and they will quiet down.
Okay.
So my message is also, aspirations is one thing, but determination is certainly also a necessity.
All right, that's so beautiful. So we hear these things that young people must be determined to initiate that particular change, but also we must not be shouting and drowning each other's voices. We must be strategic in trying to gain the results that we're wanting to gain in terms of education. Let me come to you, Hazel, and ask you, what exactly is the plight of rural young women in farming communities, young women in mining communities, young people in the rural areas, right? And what immediate actions can the government implement to ensure that the right to education is realized?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. So when we started with COVID-19, there was the issue around accessibility, affordability, and availability of education for young girls.
Yes.
We saw that at some point Zimbabwe recorded around 5,000 girls dropping out of school due to pregnancy in one province.
Yeah.
And that was a pandemic on its own. So from your question, I like the word immediate, because I think we have been talking about these issues. We've been fighting for girls' education. And I think it's now time we have immediate measures. Like, for example, number one, we need to actually enforce enrollment for girls.
Okay.
I don't know what should be done, but all the stakeholders must be involved in making sure that we have got girls enrolling in school. Because if you look at the statistics at the moment, we have got a 10% decrease of girls dropping out of school, and that is a cause of concern. Then the second one, we need to also capacitate the teachers, because it's good to have girls enrolling in school, but who's going to teach them? So if we have teachers not capacitated, not motivated, then we'll still have these problems again.
Yeah.
Then we also need to have stakeholders engagement, because the reason why we have conflicting voices from culture, from religion, girls are not being expected to get married, but we are saying that girls should be going to school. So let's have one voice. He was talking about unity, he was talking about purpose. Let's have all the stakeholders agreeing on one thing. Every girl must go back to school. Then the final one is issues on reviving and transforming our education curriculum, because we want what is girls being taught in school to meet the demands of the industry. So we just don't want girls to be taught to be good employees, but we want them to be taught to be innovative,
Okay.
to be change agents, so that they are able to come up with strategies, they are able to come up with solutions. So that is one thing that I'm always talking about every time I'm given an opportunity to speak. Let's change our education curriculum. Let's teach girls to be leaders. Let's teach girls to desire for change. Yeah.
That's a very good answer. Thank you so much, Hazel, for that insight. Let me come to you, Thembani, and ask you to just elaborate on what the advocacy terrain looks like in Zimbabwe and the kinds of measures that you have used in terms of advocacy to ensure that you're getting the results that you intend to get from the stakeholders that you have been speaking to. So maybe you can take us into your journey and what sorts of advocacy measures or strategies that you have been utilizing, and whether those you've actually seen fruit emanating from those strategies that you have been using.
Thank you so much. So I think, given that the conversation has mostly been about youth and young people, I think it's also very prudent that I also tailor my response within that area as well. I think for young people like myself, one of the biggest tools that we have in advocacy is obviously social media. When you look at social media, you look at a couple of things. Firstly, the power to inform a large number of people. Secondly, a power to create an agenda that I think is really important, and the power to amplify our voices as young people. I think when you look at how social media has been used over the years by so many young people, you find that there are so many concerns that we genuinely didn't know about, but are starting to become genuine issues because of social media. For example, when you talk about issues with suicides that are happening, especially for young men, I think we see how the power of social media in terms of informing the society on why they ought to be changed within that area. And I think similarly, it also works in this area of education, that at a point where we identify problems that young people are facing in rural areas, in most instances, you find that individuals in urban areas are not really cognizant of that. And I think there can also really be a problem in that when you have young people in urban areas not really aware, and those are usually the drivers of social media, then you usually have a problem of amplifying the voice of people within these rural areas anyway. But I think one of the strategies that we've been employing as SRHR Defenders, firstly, what we have is a group of young people who represent a large number of backgrounds within Zimbabwe. So that is, you have young people from institutions from all over the country, young people who also live from certain rural areas, some young people from urban areas. And what happens when you have a diverse community of young people like that working together is you share those opinions and you share what's happening out there. At a point where you do that, you are able to inform your advocacy points. I also think, secondly, one way in which you also do that is working with other organizations as well. Because in most instances, advocacy, when you try to advocate alone, it doesn't really work for a couple of reasons. I think one reason that was mentioned is you may end up having conflicting voices, and when they are not united, then it's really unlikely that you're going to change anything anyway. But secondly, I think advocacy is more about critical mass. It's more about how many individuals agree with whatever message that you are sharing. So I think that way working with other organizations come into play. Young people also leveraging their resources in other NGOs to simply push for other agendas. Also attending things like public hearings and consultation meetings and saying, as a young person from the rural areas, this is what I'm facing and this is what the challenges look like. I think these are strategies that mostly then target different areas, from social media to other public hearings from governments as well, which then create a larger voice within society on the issue of play.
All right. I like how nuanced your answer is. First, you talk about social media and how social media is really that avenue that we can use to bring to light some of these issues. And I think most of the times for us, social media is entertainment, and we don't realize the amount of power that we have within our palms, essentially. And I really like that you bring that up. If I may come back to you, Lars, and ask you, what types of change or impact are you expecting to see as a representative of Education Out Loud, which is partnering with NACARES, GAIO, Say What, and Facet in this GEAR Alliance program to bring about the right to education, or to see it realized? So from your perspective, what exactly is the dream? What exactly is the impact? What changes are you expecting to see from partnering with these organizations?
I think we need to realize that by and large, we have beautiful, effective policy frameworks.
Okay.
There are lots of paperwork out there saying we should do this, we will do that, and tomorrow and next year we ought to do that. So I'm not calling for additional new policy initiatives, but I am hopeful and expectant that young people can make the powers to be responsible to execute all those policies and programs that are in place, because that's where we have the problem. It's not lack of vision, it's not lack of targets, but it's lack of implementation. And this is where young people can bring to the table the voice, the aspiration, but also the evidence. I think it's critical that young people are not saying, yeah, but nobody will listen to us and we don't know anything. I think young people have that experience and thereby translate that experience into evidence and say, actually, 5,000 young Zimbabwean women left school because of pregnancies in one province. That is a significant message, a depressing message, but still also evidence that this situation is not tolerable. So I don't think there is a need for a lot of additional policies. I think it should be obvious that a young woman who has fallen pregnant during secondary school should be readmitted into the school, into the education system again. So that's the focus I would like.
All right. We love to hear that, and I really like that you bring about the issue of implementation and enforcement. Hazel, if I may just ask you, as a young woman, and there are so many other young people that are looking to, you've also implemented a number of projects trying to initiate some kind of change and to also empower young women. So how exactly do you think young women can engage with these frameworks that have been put into place, whether we talk about CEDAW, whether we talk about the International Convention on Economic and Social Rights? How can young people engage? And also, how can young people also ensure that they're leading these movements? What has been the strategy, the key for you, because you've been leading these things in your own right?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to be aware of these frameworks that we have.
All right.
Because one beautiful thing about our country is signing agreements and policies and putting them in place, though implementation is another story. So young people like myself need to be aware. Recently, if not recent, last year, the government amended the Education Act, right? And they allowed teenage mothers to go back to school.
Okay.
But if you look at it, what we now need is to hold our government accountable in terms of making sure that we enforce behavior change, acceptance and tolerance of that kind of a policy. Because if we have a policy not backed by any budget, in making sure that schools are safe for girls, there is support for them in terms of psychosocial support, there is issues around maternal health care in those particular schools, then it becomes a challenge. Then we just have a policy,
okay,
but that is not backed by any form of support whatsoever.
Okay.
So young women, young people like myself need to be aware of these policies, right? And then after being aware, they need to identify the gaps and come up with solutions. Because it's not just about complaining, it's about coming up with solutions. So you remember when we did that advocacy period, where we were training young women around knowing the educational frameworks, knowing the SADC education framework. And then when you identify the gaps and you just don't complain, you come up with solutions.
Okay, that's beautiful. Thembani, let's just bounce from what Hazel has been speaking about. She talks about knowing the frameworks. Can you tell us what can be the role of like CSOs engaging with young people and also sort of like bringing young people into these spaces where they can speak? I know for myself that I've had opportunities to speak with parliamentarians speaking on these particular frameworks, but what can CSOs do better? And how can young people be in your place, Thembani, as an SRHR defender? Like, how can young people get into the space? Because I'm sure they are watching you and saying, okay, he's actually managing to have these conversations. How can I, as a young person, have that conversation as well? And you also spoke about the voluntary national reviews. How can young people be aware of what's happening and how can they hold these governments accountable? So maybe speak to us about how can they practically be able to engage in these conversations, because they're happening, but young people don't know where they're happening.
All right, so let me start on the question of what CSOs can do better. I do agree there is a lot of lack of awareness, rather. Individuals don't really know what's going on. They are not educated about those issues. I think for CSOs, I think one really important role they ought to play is actually ensuring that their message is heard, and it's not just directed towards certain individuals but everyone else in general. For example, you usually have CSOs that are very targeted. They can target only individuals in universities and tertiary institutions, right? What about individuals who are outside those spaces? How are they supposed to know the message? Those individuals in most instances are left out and they cannot participate in those conversations. So I think there is a need to broaden reach and also to include activities that target individuals within their respective area as well. Once you start seeing a certain organization within your area, you start to become more aware about what issues they are preaching, and you also start to become involved. And then as for young people becoming also SRHR defenders like myself, I think there are so many opportunities that are there right now in status quo. For example, I think there are so many opportunities for young people that you can leverage, usually through social media, of course. Individuals mostly just go and then they look for voluntary opportunities to participate. But I would say in most instances, it's not really about going into say spaces where there's been an open call. I think most instances it usually starts on your own as an individual when you have, like you say, the power of Twitter, and then you start engaging with other individuals who are pushing the same message. Once you start doing that and those individuals identify you and then they incorporate you into the same message and say, this is what we're trying to advocate for, do you think you can also be part of the movement as well? But all in all, I do think that there is a problem with reach, there is a problem with accessibility. We need to make sure that we are present for everyone, not just a specific privileged few who can access Twitter or some other social media platforms. There's a need for NGOs to be much more inclusive and to include other individuals as well, because they also have powerful stories to tell.
All right, thank you so much, Thembani, and thank you so much to the panel that has been speaking today on how young people can hold their governments, hold the important stakeholders accountable when it comes to ensuring that the right to education is realized. What I loved about this conversation is that every single person sitting on this panel today identifies young people as experts of their own experiences, and that young people ought to have a seat at the table because they know what they are talking about and they have experienced the things that they are talking about. So we love to hear that, and we love that all of you have been watching this particular show today. We're in the Say What studio of choice, and my call to you, whether you're at home, whether you're at work, whether you're at school, is that you get involved in holding our government and holding the people who are in power accountable, and that you also consider becoming a person in power, because there is no limit that says that a person who is 19, 20, 18 cannot sit in these positions of power and make this particular decision. So it's a call to you from all of us here on this particular panel that we have the frameworks are not being implemented, and that you can do something about it even from the palm of your hand. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a talk from the Say What studio of choice, and see you next.